well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Welcome to another edition of Bearing Arms, Cam and Company. My name is Cam Edwards, and I'm glad you've joined us on the program. I'm feeling remarkably awake, considering the fact I got up at 3:45 this morning, sitting in with Larry O'Connor on WMAL in Washington, D.C. all week long. If you get the urge to partake of a morning show, we are talking a little Second Amendment issues. We talked about West Virginia's new vaccine lottery that Governor Jim Justice announced yesterday. We've got a piece up at bearingarms.com about this as well. 5 custom shotguns, 5 custom rifles included in this vaccine lottery. So anybody who's had their first dose, any West Virginia resident who has had at least their first dose of the vaccine, they are eligible for this lottery. They're giving away a couple of tricked out pickup trucks, giving away $1 million, 2 4-year scholarships to any public institution there in West Virginia. I believe the first drawing is June 20th. I don't know if I've got time to move from Virginia to West Virginia in order to be eligible for that, but yeah, I'm kind of curious about it. Meanwhile, we're also watching what's going on in Miami, where, over the weekend there was this shooting outside of a banquet hall. Police describing this as a targeted attack, gang-related in essence. But there were, and while that story, by the way, got a lot of attention, there were a couple of other shootings, defensive gun uses in Miami, that didn't get near the amount of national news attention. This story, locally, from Channel 6 in Miami Beach, man in critical condition after a woman he tried to attack shot him. This was May the 30th, about 2:30 in the afternoon. Police arrived on scene, discovered an adult male with gunshot wounds. Police say the preliminary investigation revealed that an adult female was in her vehicle when the male approached her and began to bang on her window and attack her. And then she responded to that attack by shooting him. We also have this incident happened over the weekend as well. 1 dead, 1 hospitalized after an attempted robbery ends in a shootout in Midtown Miami. So in this case, you had 2 guys who were walking their dog, rather, when somebody came up to them, tried to rob them at gunpoint. Turns out both of the guys who were walking their dog were armed themselves. And that's when the quote-unquote shootout began. The armed robber was killed. One of his intended victims was wounded in the arm. But thankfully, both of those intended victims are going to be okay. Even the dog survived, which is very good news to hear. I'm used to defensive gun uses not getting near the attention that a mass shooting is going to get. But again, if we're going to talk about violence, and if you're going to have police chiefs like Art Acevedo in Miami calling for more gun control as a result of this shooting at the banquet hall, well, I think we also need to talk about the role that armed citizens can play in preventing these types of attacks. Again, armed citizens, not the only solution. I'm not suggesting that the only thing we need to do is to ensure that constitutional carry is passed nationwide and then violent crime is going to disappear. That's a simplistic solution. It is as simplistic, frankly, as calling for universal background checks or a ban on AR-15s or a ban on quote-unquote high-capacity magazines and think that that's going to solve the violent crime problem. We absolutely need to empower individuals to exercise their Second Amendment rights. But there are still going to be some criminals out there who don't get the message, and they're going to continue to try to inflict harm on the communities that they live in and the society at large. So I wanted to spend some time with my favorite Florida man, Ryan Petty, to talk about this. Ryan has obviously delved deep into the issue of preventing both targeted attacks and violent crime more generally since his daughter was murdered at Parkland, Florida, at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School back in 2018. Ryan is a good friend. He is a tremendous advocate for the right to keep and bear arms, but he is also a guy who I think is fundamentally curious about what can effectively be done to reduce violent crime without infringing on or destroying the civil liberties that we enjoy as Americans. We had a great conversation about this. Take a look and a listen. Ryan, it's good to see you, sir. Thanks so much for coming on the program today.
Cam, it's always great to be with you.
So, we woke up, we saw the news over Memorial Day weekend about this shooting outside of a banquet hall in Miami. Didn't have a lot of details to begin with. We were told that this was a targeted attack. It looks like this was some type of gang activity. I know that Freddie Ramirez says that these were, basically wannabe gang members who were, beefing on social media and then took it public here. And there's been a lot of media attention focused on this particular shooting and, talking about the rise in violence around the country. There were a couple of other defensive gun uses in Miami this same weekend that didn't get nearly as much attention. A woman shot her attacker in one case, and then there was a couple of guys who were walking their bulldog when they were the victims of an armed robbery. As it turns out, both of the victims were also armed, and it was the armed robber who ultimately lost his life as these individuals were able to protect themselves. I'm curious to get your take on what we're seeing here, not only in Florida specifically, but around the country with the rise in violent crime and the calls by folks like, Art Acevedo, the police chief in Miami, who said over the weekend that he thinks we need to make it a federal crime to burglarize a gun store, which honestly, I hadn't really considered that before. And it's an interesting thought. I'm not automatically opposed to it. But then he said, the other thing we need these universal background checks. Which I have to say, I look at this shooting in Miami and I don't think that universal background checks would have stopped that from occurring, Ryan.
Yeah, I agree, Cam. Look, it's early and we don't know. And I want to preface all of my comments by saying my heart goes out to the families of the victims. I've read about some of the stories here and I've watched the footage. It was just a heinous crime. Innocent folks that got caught up in what appears to be a targeted attack. It's heartbreaking to see that kind of violence break out in our communities. So my heart goes out to those families. It's early. We don't know what we don't know, but my guess is background checks were not at play here. These guns were probably obtained illegally, and if they were obtained legally, then they went through a background check. So I'm not quite sure how a background check solves this problem at all. I don't have a problem with the idea of making it a federal crime to steal guns from a gun store. Interesting idea. Hadn't thought a lot about it.
Yeah, I hadn't either, honestly. But, to me, there's no issue. The only issue there, I would say, is how often that law would be utilized at the federal level. Certainly, when individuals get referred to federal court, they're typically looking at stronger sentences, longer sentences. They've got to spend more time behind bars before they're eligible for parole or early release. And so I can see the need for that. But, the criminal justice system itself has some problems. 97% of the cases, the felony cases in this country, whether at the state or federal level, end up in plea bargains. And we often see the results of this where somebody who's accused of a violent crime, and we have a segment every day on this program talking about that very thing. Somebody who's accused of a violent crime who ends up getting a slap on the wrist and often, returns to court. That's one of the frustrating things about this issue is that there is no simple solution. There is no quick fix. There's no, in fact, I believe there's no amount of gun control laws that you could put on the books that's going to have an impact here. Because at the end of the day, you're dealing with individuals and their particular motivations for carrying out a heinous attack like this. I'm guessing that the perpetrators of this attack know right from wrong. They know that what they did was not just illegal, but was morally abhorrent. It didn't matter. And so, again, I'm not sure that there's as much as I would love for there to be some sort of simple legislative fix by putting a new law on the books, I just don't know that that's going to do it.
Yeah, when you look at the nature of the attack and the fact that these perpetrators were willing to walk into walk to a crowded banquet hall and indiscriminately start firing into the crowd in order to hit their intended target. These are not people that care about background checks. These are not people that care about any kinds of law or obeying the law. So it's unlikely that any kind of firearms regulations or new laws would dissuade them. What might work, to your point, and it was interesting you brought this up in terms of the federal judicial process being more strict. We certainly could make local laws and our state laws more strict. If it's that they fear being prosecuted federally because of the penalties, then we have every reason to believe that if we strengthened our local and state laws, that would have that same effect. So, I look at cities where we've got problems like this. There were 3 incidents that I'm aware of in Miami where these, attacks happened over the past weekend. And I'll get to why I think this is happening. But, that's a slow weekend in Chicago. And Chicago's got lots of gun regulations. What they don't do, I think, effectively is catch the perpetrators and then make them pay the price by spending time in jail and in prison. It's a revolving door in many cases, or these crimes go unsolved. And so, we've got to fund our police. We've got to do better training. There's a lot we can do on the preventative side. I saw in this case in Miami, Cam, where Marcus Lemonis, who's a CNBC star, the show called The Prophet. I don't know if you've ever seen it or not. Very interesting guy. He put up $100,000 reward for this, for information leading to the arrest and, capture and arrest of these perpetrators. People will come forward because of that, because of the reward. I guess it's up to a total of 130,000 now for information. But I'm guessing people knew about this attack before. And what we need to figure out, I think, as a society is how do we get folks to let authorities know when they have information about these pending attacks? Because if we can prevent them, that's far better than trying to pay a reward for tips after the fact and after all these lives were destroyed.
Yeah, absolutely. And you and I have talked about this in terms of that Secret Service report that came out a couple of months ago on preventing targeted attacks on school grounds. Right. But I think what you're describing here is a very real phenomena. And I would actually argue that there are a couple of things at work. One, there is the hostility towards law enforcement in many quarters, right? And so you don't want to talk to the police because the police are seen as the bad guys themselves. But even for folks who don't view police as the enemy, there's, I think, a very genuine fear that if they speak up, something might happen to them. That hinders, I think, law enforcement investigations. And this is, again, nothing new. I mean, I remember back in the 1990s, you had row homes in Baltimore that were firebombed after the occupants called the police and said, hey, they're dealing drugs on the corner. Come arrest these guys. They were arrested and then they were put back out on the streets a few days later. Their associates were never put behind bars and the retaliation occurred. So one of the things that I'd actually really like to see is, the Biden administration talks about, giving $5 billion to fund gun violence prevention efforts. I'd really like to see witness protection programs and witness protection services, the budgets for those things increased dramatically and federal grant money going to local law enforcement agencies, because I think that's a huge concern. If people are afraid to speak out and they're afraid to talk to the police about what they know because of their concern over retaliation, then that does make it harder and in some cases impossible for law enforcement to find these suspects and bring them to justice.
It's an interesting idea. And there's a name, Tangela Sears. I don't know if you've heard that name or not before, but she's a mother in Miami that lost her son to gun violence. And over the weekend, she said something very similar to that, which is she wanted more money to go to finding these perpetrators and being able to prosecute them. And so the idea of funding things like you're describing, where somebody can come forward with information and be protected and be anonymous and or go into some sort of a witness protection program to protect themselves and their family, I think would be far more valuable than trying to, close a so-called, gun show loophole or whatever else we're trying to do that isn't going to solve the problem. So I think we have to make it easier for people to come forward. I think there's broad support in the community, especially here in Florida, for spending money in the right places. But I would go for victim services or ways to protect witnesses as a better use of the funds than trying to, stop, somebody from purchasing a firearm from a friend or a family member that is got almost zero chance of being used in a crime.
Absolutely. Now, you said a couple of minutes ago that you would get to what you think is driving this rise in violent crime. And I'm very curious to hear your take on this, because I know that you talk with a lot of law enforcement officials. You've been working with Sheriff Grady Judd down there in Florida. What are you hearing from police, and what are you seeing yourself that you think may be driving this increase in violent crime that we're seeing around the country?
So, if you think about what we've just been through as a nation, right, and as a society, we've been through a year unlike any year that almost anyone alive has ever experienced before. This was, 2020 was the year of lockdowns and mask mandates and an election and back and forth, over the politics of the science, really, right? But people have been locked down and away from friends and family and loved ones, and away from their typical routine. And one of the things we've learned around these school attacks has been that they typically come after a period of absence. So a suspension or an expulsion, or could be a graduation, but it's a period of absence. And then those feelings of, needing to carry out the attack kind of swell right inside these perpetrators. I just finished a book, reading a manuscript for an author, Dr. Peter Langman, who's coming out with a book very soon. And he goes through and he's analyzed a lot of these school attackers in particular. And we notice that these things come after this absence. So, we've been locked up, so to speak, as a country for the better part of a year, more than a year now. And there's been confusion and strife and disagreement over how best to protect yourself and your family and what's the right thing to do. And it's been a really turbulent time. And I can't help but think that folks that would have been seeking mental health services in a place where they weren't locked down and could do that more readily, were going to the office, just doing, going to the grocery store, just doing the normal things that we do in life. Those things didn't happen the same way in 2020. So I think I'm not surprised to see maybe a spike in violence coming after this sort of long, national pandemic that we've been through.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. Do you also think that, I thought about this last week, Jen Psaki, I always want to pronounce the P in her name, but Jen Psaki was asked, do we have a crime problem in this country? And she said, well, we have a guns problem. And, kind of pointed to the rise in gun sales as perhaps the reason for this rise in violent crime. I pointed out at Bearing Arms that, we've seen a rise in non-gun related crimes as well. Even traffic fatalities went up in 2020, though there were way fewer of us on the road, far less miles traveled, but traffic fatalities actually increased. And one of the reasons that has been given is the fact that because there were fewer people on the road, because law enforcement was sort of scaling back, they weren't arresting people unless they absolutely needed to. They didn't want to have, the pandemic break out behind bars. That there was just this sort of, I don't want to say a culture of lawlessness, but it was this sort of enabling effect. If you wanted to break the law, it was a little bit easier to do so without facing any consequences, whether we're talking about driving 90 miles down the road or, again, committed an armed robbery or a carjacking or taking an innocent human life. That also played a role in the spike in crime that we saw that began in 2020 has really continued this year.
Oh, I agree. And then you looked at the summer, right, where mostly peaceful protests turned into riots and looting and all of the other things that were going on. And very few, if any of those people were actually charged with a crime or held accountable for those actions. So I think people learn, right? You're frustrated. You've been locked up. You may have lost your job. You may have lost your business. Things aren't going well at home. There are a lot of pressures and anxiety on folks. And then you see sort of lawlessness break out over the summer. And clearly we're frustrated as a society. And I can't help but think that, coupled with the fact that people aren't seeking medical care in the ways they did, including mental health services, that, I'm not surprised to see this spike right now. I've not seen any studies that indicate causality here or anything like that. So I don't want to go further than that, but I'm just trying to say, look, we know that school attacks generally happen after a break, in sort of coming back to school the first week or two after school starts. And I can't help but think, as we sort of restart our society and people go back to work and kind of get back to quote unquote normal, whatever that means now, that a lot of that anxiety and frustration that's built up over the past year, and then seeing what we saw over the summer, I can't help but think that we're going to see a spike.
Well, I'd love to say that you're wrong, but sadly, I agree with you. I think we will see that. And unfortunately, I think we're already seeing it to some degree. And I hope that as, life returns to quote unquote normal, that those folks who are feeling that stress, who are feeling that pressure, I hope that they do reach out to someone to talk to, whether it is a crisis hotline, whether it's finding a counselor they can meet with either virtually or in person. There's absolutely no shame in getting help when you're having these types of thoughts. And there's also, getting back to your original point, there's also no shame in telling somebody when you see someone else in the midst of a crisis or threatening, engaging in threatening behavior. This is the best way to stop it, is to say something.
100%. Call law enforcement. They can guide you to the right place. It doesn't always end in an arrest, but it ends up better than it would have if you didn't make the call. And that's just how it is. So if you see somebody in distress, friend or family member or neighbor, now's the time to reach out and take care of each other. And I think if we do that, we can get through this next period where we get back to whatever is normal, right? Whatever that means.
Right. Absolutely. All right. One last question for you, Ryan, and I don't know if you even know the answer to this, but do you think, does the increase in violence that we've seen in Florida, does that change the calculus at all politically in terms of gun control? I mean, you still have groups like Ban Assault Weapons Now who are, trying to get on the ballot to ban AR-15s. You've got Nikki Fried, who just announced she's running for governor, wanting to take on Ron DeSantis. And obviously she's going to be talking a lot about, quote unquote, common sense, gun safety regulations. How do you think this is going to play out politically in Tallahassee in terms of the rising violent crime and the calls from the left for more gun control?
Well, fortunately, we're blessed with a great legislature and a great governor. I'd like to say best governor in the 50 states. So we're fortunate to have Governor DeSantis. So I don't think the calls for more gun control will go very far. Fortunately, they're not the solution. And so I don't think we'll see that happen here in Florida. What I do think is that you'll actually see an expansion of freedom. That's been what the governor has been calling for since the beginning of his term in office. And of course, when he was elected, he had no idea that, he'd be facing a pandemic, a global pandemic, and have to carve a different path for Florida than many other governors and many other states took. And so been very, very pleased with the approach the governor's taken. He's followed the science, as they say. We opened our schools very quickly. We got our kids back in school so people could get back to their jobs and back to life and back to some sense of normalcy. We didn't see any outbreaks or any concerns in the schools. So we did that very safely. I think calls for more gun control in the state of Florida are going to fall on deaf ears. And I think that's good. We can weather this storm and get through it. And then I'd like to see the Florida legislature and the governor actually expand gun rights in the state of Florida, including constitutional carry, which should have gotten further than it did in the legislature this year. And I think there are lots of folks in Florida that will be pushing for that next session.
I suspect that you're right. And the fact that, Texas Governor Greg Abbott going to sign constitutional carry as well as a Second Amendment sanctuary legislation, I don't want to say it puts pressure on Ron DeSantis and Republicans in Florida, but it kind of does in a way. I think that especially we talk about 2024, there's a lot of talk about Greg Abbott running for president, a lot of talk about Ron DeSantis running for president. And I would hope that there's some positive peer pressure that's applied by Texas embracing constitutional carry and Second Amendment sanctuary language. I'd love to see that happen in Florida, too.
Now, it's one of the beauties of our federal system, right, is each state can experiment a little bit. And you're seeing that. We saw that massively in 2020 with the response to the pandemic. Mm-hmm. States that were more open and didn't do the lockdowns and versus the states that did. And so they're laboratories, and it's wonderful. It's a wonderful experiment. I love the competition, and bring it on, Texas.
All right, Ryan, as always, sir, it is good talking with you. Now that I'm fully vaccinated and I can actually hang out with people in person, we need to try to figure out a way to do this on camera stuff in the same room in the very near future.
I'd like that very much.
Me too, sir. Ryan Petty, as always, thank you so much for your time. Again, really thank Ryan Petty for joining us on the program. Hopefully we'll get a chance to talk to him again in the very near future. Right now, though, let's turn our attention to today's Armed Citizen story. I know we already had two of them, but we're going to give you one more. Our good deed of the day, our recidivist report. Let's start there. New York State, where a judge has set bail at $1 for a suspect in a murder case in Albany, New York. Yeah, $1. Now, as it turns out, this murder suspect is still behind bars because federal authorities have said, well, he violated his probation in another case, so we're gonna hold him. So that's the good news. This guy did not actually get out after having to post just $1 bond, but Jawan Saab is the suspect in question. He was charged with murder for a fatal shooting in Albany, New York that left 5 others with gunshot wounds. And prosecutors there locally say that City Court Judge Joshua Farrell lacked authority to set bail in the case to begin with, and that he misapplied some of these bail reform laws that were passed by Democrats, signed by Governor Andrew Cuomo over the past couple of years. The judge set bail at $1 after Saab's attorney said they were going to waive going forward with a preliminary hearing. That would have required prosecutors to present evidence for charging him with fatally shooting 35-year-old Sharf Adelim. So this case is going to go to a grand jury. The DA said, we're searching right now to determine whether or not this can be appealed. We're still exploring these options, but luckily there's a federal probation hold. But if they lift that probation hold, then we have a person who's accused of murder walking the streets on $1 bail. Saab's attorney, Rebecca Sokol, who's an assistant public defender there, said the judge's intention was, quote, trying to make sure that his time counts. No matter what, he's not going anywhere. Well, again, that's not exactly true. Because if the Justice Department and the U.S. Attorney's Office in this case were to lift that probation hold, then, yeah, Mr. Saab would be going somewhere. He'd have to literally pay 4 quarters and he could walk out of jail until that grand jury potentially returns a charge here. Saab, by the way, does have a previous criminal history. Back in 2017, he was arrested in Troy, New York, charged with felony gang assault, as well as assault with intent to cause serious physical injury with a weapon. He later pleaded guilty to a felony assault charge. No word on what type of sentence he received. Back in February of this year, he was sentenced to 8 months in jail by a federal judge In that case, he admitted using Facebook Live videos to threaten Troy police. This was I guess this was so this was actually last year, last February. He was sentenced to 8 months in jail. And then 3 years of supervised release, which, again, he allegedly violated when he allegedly committed this murder. So, I'd love to say that the justice system is going to work perfectly and Juwan Saab is going to remain behind bars until his murder trial takes place. I have no faith or confidence in that whatsoever. And because of New York's criminal justice reform efforts, or the bail reform efforts, you now have a situation where you can literally be accused of taking a human life, of injuring 5 other people, and you can get out of jail after posting $1 bail. All right, on to today's armed citizen story. Another from Florida, by the way. I know we just gave you 2 from Miami a little bit ago, but we've got one from Sarasota. This from the Bradenton Herald, where a homeowner shot and killed a man who was breaking into his home. This was late Tuesday night. Deputies reported that an individual had been found dead at the scene. This morning, the sheriff's office released more information, reporting that a homeowner had shot the suspect as he was attempting to break into the home there. Sheriff's office has not released the name of the alleged intruder, but noted that the deceased man and the homeowner did not know one another. Sheriff's office said, quote, detectives and forensics personnel currently processing the crime scene. Additional details will be released later today. So hopefully we'll get more information. But what we know is that that case in Sarasota, Florida, according to the sheriff's office, a case of armed self-defense, and the homeowner not expected to face any charges. Finally today, our good deed of the day. And I got to tell you, I love this story. This is from also from Fort Myers, Florida. I don't know why we're so Florida-centric on this program today. I feel like the Florida Tourism Bureau, well, maybe not with the topics that we're discussing. I was going to say maybe they should sponsor the program, but probably not. But, okay, so armed citizen story from Florida. Good deed of the day from Florida. Fort Myers, Florida. Tiara Brown. This is Tiara. She is a former professional boxer. She actually won the gold medal in the 2012 World Championships for Team USA. And she got a degree in criminal justice from Columbus University. And she became a police officer in Washington, D.C. 2019, she was named the Metropolitan Police Officer of the Year. And she said this is not easy for her to be a black woman and a police officer. She said, people say, are you black or are you blue? And she said, well, of course I'm black. Anyone can see that. But she says, I'm a person. I'm a child of God. And I'm a community servant. And she really is a community servant. She has started a scholarship program. Didn't go out and get corporate funding for this. This is her own money. It's the Tiara Brown Academic and Athletic Scholarship. And students in Southwest Florida are eligible for this. Tiara Brown spent 6 years with the Metropolitan Police Department in Washington, D.C., but she's now moved back home to Fort Myers, Florida. And she is serving with the Fort Myers Police Department. So she has put together this scholarship program. And this year, 2 students each received a $1,000 college scholarship. Not only thanks to Tiara Brown, but there was another individual in the community, Keith White, who matched Tiara Brown's scholarship money. And these 2 kids are going to be going to college in part because of the support that Officer Brown has given them. So I know most of our good deeds of the day are instances where someone was in the right place at the right time, willing and able to do the right thing, as we say. This is more of a long-term good deed. This takes some time, putting money aside, saving it for not a rainy day, but for a worthy cause of helping individuals who might not otherwise be able to get a higher education, to help them reach their potential. And so I imagine that Tiara Brown would say that she's actually in the right place at home in her hometown of Fort Myers, Florida. Certainly doing the right thing. And Officer Tiara Brown, we do thank you for your very good deed. That is all the time we've got for you on this edition of Bearing Arms, Cam and Company. We will be back tomorrow with the latest Second Amendment news and information from all across the nation. Don't forget, you can subscribe to bearingarms.com. You can become a VIP member. You're going to get exclusive analysis, commentary, and more. All you have to do is go to bearingarms.com/subscribe. You can use the promo code GUNS to get 25% off of your membership. If you want to go above and beyond that, you're certainly welcome to do so. You can become a VIP Gold member as well. That'll get you access to even more good stuff, not just at Town Hall, but throughout the not just Bearing Arms, but throughout the Town Hall Media family of websites. You can also find us on YouTube by looking for Town Hall Media, or on rumble.com. Just look up Bearing Arms, Cam and Company. You can find us there. And Amazon Podcasts, Apple Podcasts. See, now I'm starting to fade. That getting up at 3:45 in the morning stuff starting to impact me. So I better wrap it up here. Let's just end it here. We'll see you tomorrow. Until then, be well, be safe, and be free.